Hi, my name is Jessica, and my neighbors and I have been organizing to take a stand against the use of eminent domain for the CO2 pipeline projects in Iowa. We've distributed yard signs, we've cheered each other on at public meetings, we've sent letters to the Iowa Utilities Board, and contacted all of our Iowa legislators multiple times, and our little group has grown in numbers, joining with a statewide nonprofit organization to help us fight against the abuse of eminent domain. Why are we so opposed to CO2 pipeline projects? That's what I'm going to share with you so that you get the other side of the story, the side that the corporations aren't telling you, and then you can decide what you think about them for yourself. For several months now, two CO2 pipeline projects have been under consideration in Iowa. Summit Carbon Solutions, which proposes to capture CO2 and transport it to North Dakota, and Navigator CO2 Ventures, which plans to transport the supercritical liquid CO2 to Illinois. Recently, we found out that there is a third carbon pipeline, this one proposed by Wolf Carbon Solutions for ADM, and like Navigator, transporting the supercritical CO2 to Illinois. All three pipeline companies are seeking to use eminent domain for their projects. Wolf has said verbally that they don't want to use eminent domain, but their letter to landowners writes that, quote, "We may need to request the right of eminent domain or condemnation," end quote. Now, eminent domain is a power granted by the government to take away your property or the use of your own property against your will. Eminent domain as an extraordinary governmental power that condemns your private property for someone else's use can only be used for public convenience and necessity, at least according to the law. What is public convenience and necessity? In Iowa, a corporation's economic development is not enough to warrant eminent domain. In a legal case brought before the Iowa Supreme Court in 2019, the court found that, quote, "trickle-down benefits of economic development are not enough to constitute a public use," end quote. And the court, being somewhat sarcastic here, spelled out, quote, "If economic development alone were a valid public use, then instead of building a pipeline, a company could constitutionally condemn Iowa farmland to build a palatial mansion, which could be defended as a valid public use so long as 3,100 workers were needed to build it, it employed 12 servants, and it accounted for 27 million in property taxes," end quote. Well, in Iowa, this kind of thing simply is not allowed. Therefore, we have to look closely at what Wolf is claiming about its project. Do these CO2 pipelines promote public convenience and necessity? This general question breaks down into three specific questions. First, in the material sent out to affected landowners, Wolf writes that they, quote, "will safely capture, compress, and transport CO2," end quote. Are these pipeline projects safe? I ask this because it cannot be convenient nor necessary to force the public to live under conditions of unreasonable risk. Secondly, are these projects a necessary public good for the environment? The claim by the pipeline companies is that their carbon capture will assist in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We will look at that claim. Thirdly, are these projects a necessary public good for the future of ethanol? The company claims that they will be, quote, "establishing infrastructure necessary to reduce the carbon footprint of various industries in the Midwest," end quote. And we'll look at that claim as well. So these three questions will be explored in depth, and I am grateful to you for taking an interest in these matters. I want to begin by focusing on safety concerns. Many of us already live near gas or petroleum pipelines, and we don't give them a second thought. They are established infrastructure, and we willingly live with the minimal risks that they pose, which are, by the way, very well understood. But as it turns out, pipelines that transport supercritical CO2 are quite different from any other kind of pipeline that currently runs through Iowa. What is CO2? Is it the stuff in the atmosphere, a gas in its natural state? Well, not what they're going to be transporting. According to De Norska Veritas, or DNV, which is the industry's leading risk management research company, The typical amount of CO2 in the air that we breathe by volume is 0.04%. This does not harm us. But what will be transported via these pipelines is quite different. It is 99.9% or pure CO2 in what scientists call a supercritical or dense phase state. This is kind of a fancy way to talk about a gas that has been put under so much pressure, like about 2000 psi, that it is forced into a different state, a supercritical state. And supercritical, or sometimes they call it liquid or dense phase, carbon dioxide is uniquely unstable and dangerous. The liquefied carbon dioxide that these projects will capture is 99.9% carbon dioxide. That's what the industry calls pure CO2. And compare that to the 0.04% we breathe in the air. According to DNV's research, concentrations of 10% to 15% carbon dioxide can cause, quote, headache, increased heart rate, dizziness, rapid breathing, and unconsciousness in less than 1 minute. At higher concentrations, within 1 minute, it can cause, quote, unconsciousness, convulsions, coma, and death. Carbon dioxide is an asphyxiant, and only about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines exist in the US, less than 1% of the total pipelines in our country. CO2 pipelines are not like other oil and gas pipelines. As it turns out, what travels through the pipe and under what pressure matters a lot. So it's not really about the pipe here, it's about what's going through the pipe. While a typical gas pipeline is under 500 to 1400 psi, a CO2 pipeline operates under 1300 to 2100 psi. The extra high pressure means that a rupture would release CO2 at an explosive force. We know that carbon pipeline ruptures can and do happen. DNV has conducted testing to see what this would look like. Here's a short video of one such test demonstration conducted in England. And you'll notice as we're looking, the camera is high above the buried pipeline here in the landscape. And there's a whole forest of evergreens to the right on the screen. And the pipeline will rupture beneath the road that has been created, which is in the center of the screen.
Shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in the safe environment of the DNVGL Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
So the voiceover there said that the viewer should note that the extent of the plume is not necessarily the extent of the dense gas. And I think you could see in that video when the gas hits the camera. So the gas actually expands further than the plume itself. But for right now, I just want to focus on the plume. So a peer-reviewed scientific article published in July 2021 called Risks and Safety of CO2 Transport via Pipeline reports the results of this experiment. I will compare them to Navigator's CO2 pipeline project because Wolf has not yet released specific details about their project, although we expect theirs to be similar. The rupture of an 8-inch diameter steel pipe buried underground under pressure and temperature parameters equivalent to Navigator's pipeline project resulted in 136 tons of CO2 released in 204 seconds. That's under 4 minutes. The visible plume caused by the CO2 went up approximately 197 feet and spread out horizontally across the ground approximately 1,312 feet. That's 1/4 mile. What is the visible plume? Well, in there is a solid form of CO2, basically like dry ice. And in a section of their industry standard publication called Design and Operation of Carbon Dioxide Pipelines from September 2021, DNV warns that, quote, inhalation of air containing solid CO2 particles within a release cloud is particularly hazardous, since this could result in cryogenic burns to the respiratory tract, as well as additional toxicological impact due to sublimation in the lungs. Representatives from both Navigator and Wolf have admitted at their public informational meetings, which I attended and took notes and recorded, that by default, the minimum setback for habitable structures would be 25 feet from the pipeline. What about PHMSA, the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration? PHMSA's job is to regulate the pipe itself within the 50-foot right-of-way, hence the 25-foot distance between the pipe itself and our houses. So they don't touch anything outside of that right-of-way. They have no regulatory authority over the siting of pipelines, over where the pipelines are built. They can only control what happens within that right-of-way. States that have experience with carbon pipelines, states like Oklahoma, Texas, and Wyoming, have recognized this safety loophole. And according to an article called Citing Carbon Dioxide Pipelines from the Oil and Gas, Natural Resources and Energy Journal, have passed their own legislation to regulate the siting of these pipelines. For example, a required minimum distance from a school. But we have no such protections in Iowa because, frankly, we have no experience with carbon pipelines at all. As a result, for example, the pipeline route puts potential housing developments, parks, farms, homes, major roads, and even school districts in the pipeline corridor. Is that safe? DNV, the world's leading authority on recommended practice for the design and operation of CO2 pipelines, does not specify a distance from the pipeline that would be safe in case of a rupture. That is because even they do not know. No one knows. According to DNV, it depends on many different factors, not just the diameter of the pipe, not just the construction of the steel, the pressure under which the CO2 was traveling, or the distance between safety valves. It also depends on local topography, on soil composition, ambient temperature, wind speed, and other highly variable factors. In the end, it's really not about distance, it's about concentration and time. DNV developed a graph to show how this works. The red line indicates significant likelihood of death, while the blue line indicates a scientifically specified level of toxicity, which is when you will suffer very harmful effects. At concentrations of 10%, you will likely die in 15 minutes. So that's a mixture of concentration and time, right? But at concentration of 15%, you will likely die within 1 minute. How long do you have to escape? By the way, unless you have an electric vehicle, car engines will stall out and fail if they are in an area of high CO2 concentration, because their engines too need oxygen to run. How do we site these pipelines safely? At the public informational meetings with Wolf and the IUB in August 2022, Wolf's engineer said, quote, the industry doesn't have a standard, end quote, and quote, the results aren't in on the dispersion modeling, end quote, like how far the gas will travel if there's a rupture. And when asked to estimate what distance he would recommend to avoid death from a pipeline rupture, he said something in the, quote, 800 to 1,500 foot range, end quote. That's a really large range because so much is unknown about how supercritical CO2 disperses, but notice that 25 feet is not a recommended option. What we do know is that the day scientists conducted the test demonstration of a CO2 pipeline rupture under the auspices of DNV, the one that you watched, the visible plume of CO2 traveled 1/4 of a mile, about 1,300 feet, in under 4 minutes. And now, thanks to a real-life accident, we also know that the gas form of CO2 can travel much farther than that. We learned that, unfortunately, when a CO2 pipeline owned by Denbury Resources suddenly ruptured on a Saturday night in February of 2020 in Satarsha, Mississippi. This is the town of, well, it's like a little village of Satarsha. The rupture of the 24-inch pipe released 9,532 barrels, or 401 ton, in the 8 minutes that it took before the pipeline was shut down. That's over 3 times as much as what you saw in the video from DNV. Photos show that after the rupture, there is not even a speck of life, a speck of grass left. Yet, because the rupture happened in a densely wooded area 1 mile from the town center with no houses nearby, and because the town had a tiny population, 38 people, according to the census, that emergency responders were able to evacuate, there were no deaths, only people sent to the hospital. Still, emergency responders later described what they found. Some people choking, some unconscious, some in a seizure, and others foaming at the mouth. In this case, distance was the difference between hospitalization and death, because distance from the pipeline rupture determined the concentration of CO2 in the air, therefore how many minutes they had to get out of there. The gas form of CO2 released from the pipeline rupture traveled over 5,000 feet to the center of Satarsha, Mississippi. But in Iowa, many of us will be forced to live, work, learn, and play within tens of feet of these pipelines, forced by the power of eminent domain. Recently, PHMSA announced that it must, quote, strengthen its safety oversight of carbon dioxide pipelines around the country to protect communities from dangerous pipeline failures, end quote, a move that they're making as a result of their investigation into what happened in Satarsha, Mississippi. But the new rulemaking to update those standards that PHMSA describes will take several years to put into place, since the research funding opportunities that they offered have a timeline of 24 to 36 months. That's 2 to 3 years just to start doing the research. Why are CO2 pipelines being built in Iowa before the necessary safety studies have been completed? How can we consider such willful risk-taking to be a public good? Recently, this week, I think, in fact, California, a state also considering a build out of CO2 pipelines, passed a law that prohibits the construction of any new CO2 pipelines until PHMSA has issued its new safety rules. This makes sense. If you must do something, why wouldn't you want to do it safely? So here is the law. Pipelines shall only be utilized to transport carbon dioxide to or from a carbon dioxide capture, removal, or sequestration project once the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration has concluded the rulemaking regarding minimum federal safety standards for transportation of carbon dioxide by pipeline, and the carbon dioxide capture, removal, or sequestration project operator demonstrates that the pipeline meets those standards, end quote. Iowans deserve the same protection. CO2 pipelines should not be built until PHMSA closes the knowledge gap on the issue of safety. So now I'd like to turn to the second question. Are these projects a public convenience and necessity for the environment? The reason that the CO2 will be captured is to sequester it or bury it underground. In Iowa, we're being told that that would reduce the carbon footprint of ethanol and help address concerns about climate change. But there's more to this story, as it turns out. Like all 3 of the projects under review in Iowa, Wolf's would transport supercritical CO2 to a facility out of state where it will be injected or sequestered underground. It sounds very green. Unfortunately, it's only one part of the story. Liquid CO2, which is what we're talking about with these pipelines, is a commodity. It's worth something. It's sold and bought, as the oil and gas industry itself will tell you. That's because it is used as a tool for more oil and gas extraction. You've probably heard of fracking, but maybe you haven't heard of enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. So CO2 EORs, enhanced oil recovery, by using this liquid CO2, which is sequestered into the ground and then enables the oil companies to pull up more barrels of oil. Enhanced oil recovery has been used by the oil industry for decades, mainly down in Texas and Louisiana, but also now in places like Wyoming, Colorado, and North Dakota. By injecting the liquid CO2 into the ground, where, by the way, it is stored, that part of the story is true, oil companies extract barrels of oil out of fields that were otherwise depleted. How much oil? A lot. For example, at a facility called Petronova, which was recently shut down, actually, the Journal of Petroleum Technology reports that in less than 1 year, they, quote, captured 1 million tons of CO2 and increased oil production by 1,300%, end quote. For over a decade, the oil and gas industry has been searching for a reliable source of CO2 with which to pursue enhanced oil recovery. As you can see in the corner of this slide from ARI, Advanced Resources International, what they do is enhanced oil recovery. Quote, the single largest constraint to increased use of CO2 EOR is the lack of available affordable CO2 supplies, end quote. You can see that this slide is from 2013. That's just before the oil and gas industry hit upon the idea of using CO2 from ethanol as their supply for enhanced oil recovery. But I'll tell you more about that later. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? The enhanced oil recovery came first. Only later did they turn to ethanol. What is important to note for now is that oil, when used, generates more CO2. As it turns out, more than what was sequestered in the first place. So according to an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, for every 1 ton of CO2 that they pump into the ground, they pull out 2 to 3 barrels of oil, which generates over 1.2 tons of new CO2. The process adds more CO2 to the atmosphere than it takes out. This article from Biophysical Economics and Sustainability confirms that although, quote, fossil fuel interests have moved to reframe an old oil extraction technique, enhanced oil recovery, as a new climate mitigation method, they found that this process is, quote, net CO2 additive. CO2 emissions exceeds removals, end quote. Over 90% of liquid CO2 in the world is currently used for enhanced oil recovery. This is according to the Global CCS Institute, an international think tank headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. Indeed, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line in Alberta, Canada, owned and operated by Wolf, uses enhanced oil recovery. That's its purpose. Even most demonstration or pilot programs are driven by the fossil fuel industry. But one in the US, connected to ADM's facility in Decatur, Illinois, pursued storage or sequestration only. This project, which by the way didn't require much of a pipeline, the company injected the CO2 on site, was funded by the federal government to the tune of hundreds of millions of tax dollars. From November 2011 to November 2014, they injected liquid CO2 down into the ground, where, by the way, it doesn't just stay put or solidify into rock, it does migrate, and they track that. Did they lower their greenhouse gas emissions? No. According to data tracked by the EPA, in 2010, the year before carbon capture and sequestration began, their annual total facility emissions in metric tons of CO2 was a little over 4.4 million. In 2011, the year they began sequestering, it went up to 4.6 million tons. In fact, every year from 2011 to 2014, the years of their sequestration project, CO2 emissions actually increased rather than decreased, peaking at a little under 4.7 million tons in 2014. In 2015, when they stopped capturing and sequestering the CO2, their emissions actually decreased to 4.4 million tons. You see, the process of capturing, dehydrating, and injecting requires a tremendous amount of energy, and that generates additional CO2. The net addition of CO2 to the atmosphere is not a public convenience and necessity. Do we know for certain that Iowa's CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery? We don't know for certain. But according to Minnesota Public Radio in 2021, Bruce Rastetter, the head of Summit, admitted that his economic model for the pipelines wouldn't be viable without federal tax dollars for enhanced oil recovery. And David Giles, COO of Navigator, admitted at public meetings in December and January that because the pipeline company simply transported the liquid CO2 but didn't technically own it, he could not say what would be done with it in the end. Wolf has verbally denied that they intend to pursue EOR. They could be right, but we have no binding document from them, and it doesn't bode well that both Summit and Navigator began saying the same thing before they changed their tunes. It's rather telling to look at this map. From a study under the auspices of Princeton University, but funded by ExxonMobil and BP, funded by the oil and gas industry, the green dots represent bioenergy sources of CO2, like ethanol and fertilizer facilities in the Midwest. And the gray shading show the location of oil fields where enhanced oil recovery could be used. Please notice North Dakota and Illinois on this map, precisely the destinations for the Summit, Navigator, and Wolf pipelines. The lines connecting them on the map are the pipelines necessary for CO2 transport. They're proposing a vast structure across the country. What, for example, does a company like ADM know about this national plan for enhanced oil recovery? Well, here's a slide from a PowerPoint presentation by Scott McDonald, Biofuels Development Director at ADM, housed at the Department of Energy website. The presentation as a whole contains research as recent as 2020. Those were the slides that show how the CO2, once it's sequestered, it migrates underground. And so I believe that we can consider this a fairly current source of information. In this slide, the Illinois Basin potential describes the millions of barrels of oil that will be recoverable by injecting liquid CO2 into the ground of depleted oil fields in Illinois. Indeed, there have been multiple studies by the oil and gas industry about the, quote, stranded oil prize, end quote, that waits underground in Illinois. However, there is no such oil prize in Iowa. So that leads me to my third question. What about ethanol? Are the CO2 pipelines necessary for ethanol's future? As it turns out, ADM knows the answer to this question as well. This report from March of 2020 was commissioned by ADM to look at several options for reducing CO2, including the option of carbon sequestration. But in this report, carbon sequestration comes in dead last of all the options. You see, right now, the carbon that the technology can capture is only the CO2 from biogenic sources, from the corn fermentation. That's because the corn fermentation produces a very pure stream of CO2, CO2 not mixed with other gases, and that is the easiest to capture, dehydrate, and pressurize for transport through a pipeline. Indeed, that's why the oil and gas industry wants it from ethanol facilities for the use of enhanced oil recovery. They tried to get it from coal and found out that the technology simply wasn't viable. But this biogenic CO2 is actually a relatively small portion of ethanol's own carbon footprint. 70% of ADM's on-site emissions comes from coal. According to them, this is their own report. The real problem is coal, not corn. No surprise then that ADM's report concludes that the most effective way that they can lower their carbon footprint is to wean themselves off of coal. That and increase other efficiencies around their facility. They call it the energy treasure hunt. Poets, another giant in the ethanol industry, also has alternative ways to actually stop producing more carbon dioxide in the first place, rather than capturing and transporting it for the oil industry. In other words, to go green, they don't need an interstate pipeline that would transport hazardous waste through rural Iowa countryside, and they don't need to take our land through eminent domain. Again, no one knows this better than ADM. When a bill to stop the use of eminent domain came up in the Iowa State Senate last winter, SF 2160, neither ADM nor Poet registered opposition to the bill. Clearly, they know that the CO2 pipelines aren't necessary. They're just being forced to get on board and push this through because their competitor, Summit, seems to be unstoppable. And yet, hundreds of Iowans, including me, continue to contact our legislators and ask them to stop the use of eminent domain for private projects like these, because the threat of eminent domain has a host of consequences for rural landowners. As it turns out, Iowa recently experienced a kind of test case of modern pipeline construction when Dakota Access came through our state in 2016. Photos graciously provided by an Iowa farmer who went through it show evidence of mixing of soils, compaction, drainage of water into surrounding fields, damage to the tiling, and more. You see, the pipeline company obeyed the letter of the law when they separated out the topsoil from the subsoil, but then they drove over the topsoil while they were building the pipeline, mixing the soils, and they worked the land under extremely wet conditions, compacting the soil. The tiling never was made right, and farmers were left with reduced fertility, problems with erosion, and lowered yields. You can see the scar 2 years later. All of this has direct financial consequences for rural families, of course. Moreover, this letter from State Farm Insurance warns an affected landowner that, quote, as history has proved, any pipeline has a chance to fail, leak, and seep, resulting in significant damage to life and property. To place this type of risk or burden upon unwilling landowners like yourselves is tantamount to placing a risk to your livelihood without your permission. In summary, having a pipeline running through your property carrying CO2, a pollutant, subjects you to substantial uninsurable exposure, end quote. And Linn County's Farm Bureau, citing, quote, potential infringement on the property rights of Iowans, end quote, submitted an objection to the Iowa Utilities Board against Navigator's proposed pipeline, stating, quote, representing Linn County Farm Bureau members, I'm from Linn County, we are requesting the Iowa Utilities Board to deny the use of eminent domain for Navigator at this time, end quote. Let me close with one last thought. Look, maybe you think that this issue is about his backyard or her backyard, that this issue just boils down to money. After all, everyone knows that a farmer's wealth is in the land. But my experience in the last months, listening to my neighbors, has shown me how this issue cuts to the very core of our values. Private corporations want to take the part of the wealth that is seen on a property deed, but they disregard what the land really means. They disregard the part that is the true gift. Land for many of us means something more than just a line on a balance sheet. Many of us come from families who have lived here and farmed here for generations, and I am the 7th generation in my family to live on good Iowa soil. As the descendant of pioneers, it is not lost upon me that the land never truly belonged to my family in the first place. The taking of land from Native peoples was one of our nation's original sins, and this crime against nations was sanctioned according to the rules of the common carrier, the railroad. The justification for the CO2 pipelines is strikingly similar. They claim to be a common carrier, like a railroad. Will ours be the generation to see that crime repeated? You see, Mother Nature is more powerful than any history, than any people. Over the course of 7 generations, like a flowing river, she's worn away the sharp edges of our pride, corrected us, and put us in our place, so that we too know that the land does not belong to us, but we belong to the land. And so we're fighting these pipelines, not just because we are affected. It's about more than just us. It's about all those who lived and loved the land before us and those who will come after us. It's about heritage and it's about hope. It's about our neighbors, about what it means to be a community and to treat one another with respect, to live with humility. Land for us is about the abundance of life that is rooted in the earth and that fundamentally is not of our own making. We live our lives in relation to something that is greater than just ourselves. This is the true gift, the true wealth that the land gives to us. It's because of this that so many of us will not sign voluntary easements with these pipeline companies, no matter the dollar amount. And the state of Iowa should stand with us, not against us. So if you want to join us, please consider emailing me and I'll put you in touch with trusted organizations working to stop these CO2 pipelines. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you for paying so close attention to an issue that is really at the core of who we are out here. Thank you.